Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening. Particularly, of course, John Fullerton, that is, who are thrilled to have with us today. I'm Jenny, and I'm part of the team here at Volans. Louise, who normally, as you know, is in the hot seat on book club, has unfortunately been pulled away this evening and at the last minute, so I'm stepping in. And I'm really looking forward to the opportunity to chat with John and to put your questions to him too over the course of the evening. So this is a book club with a bit of a twist in that it's effectively an advanced preview of John's forthcoming book, John Fullerton, which we'll be hearing about later. Welcome to the Volans Book Club, John Fullerton. It's wonderful to have you here. I'm sure most people here know of you as the architect of regenerative economics, but for those who aren't fully aware of your backstory, I'd like to start by asking you a bit about your background and your earlier experiences on the journey that has brought you to this point. So as some here will know, you had a very successful sort of 20 plus years career on Wall Street and at JP Morgan, and you must have sort of come to know that world very well. So really, the question, I guess, is what caused you to leave, and was there a specific experience or an incident that prompted it?
Sure, thanks, Jenny, and thanks everyone for joining us here on the fraudulent book club, the book club without a book. I feel added pressure to get the damn thing done now. So, that's very helpful. So yeah, my journey is a bit unconventional, and I right after I graduated university, I went to work at a bank called Morgan Guaranty Trust Company, which, if you're old enough to remember, that was a really white shoe, prestigious, highly ethical bank that rebranded itself as JP Morgan not too long after I started in the early 80s. And I spent nearly 20 years there. As Jenny mentioned, I was sort of lucky and caught the derivatives wave when it first took off and did the globalization thing, Tokyo, London, New York, and really had a fabulous time. And it was a really innovative and extraordinary time in finance. And of course, all of that would essentially go pretty horribly, badly come the financial crisis in 2008. And honestly, it was building up to that while I was still there. But I always like to point out that I left not only JP Morgan, but Wall Street in 2001. So I was honestly as shocked at what happened in 2008 as any observer on the street. It had morphed into kind of a violent and obviously rudderless and ethicless business in ways and on a scale that I never could have imagined. But the short version of my leaving is that I honestly had a kind of a growing itch and voice that wouldn't go away. There was no sort of single event that triggered it other than the merger with Chase. And that really just made it easy to leave because my stock options vested. So I left in the summer of 2001 with no plans, no idea what I was going to do next, other than I just needed to leave the place I was. And honestly, I was already dabbling in this idea we now call impact investing. And so I was interested in the education reform issues. And anyway, it was completely unexpected when I discovered the environmental crisis and discovered complexity science and kind of concluded that pretty much everything I thought explained how the world works was fatally flawed. And thus the unconventional second half of my career, I guess.
Well, I wonder, if it's not too personal a question, sort of what did your wife say when you decided to leave that job and that kind of that security? Because I'm minded to look at the object behind you, and when we've had a call before, you told us about where that came from. And
oh yeah, I forgot that. I need to be more Zoom conscious. I guess it's an invitation for a question. Well, so my wife was extremely supportive. And, I mean, not to be, I don't want to overstate this, but it's one thing to quit your job when you have no income and no assets. And it's another thing to have had a ridiculously fortunate ride on the early derivatives wave and have some savings. So we had 3 young children at the time, and it was unsettling, but my wife and I both understood that it was something I just needed to do for my own sake and for really, honestly, for my soul. But I then, once I learned about, in particular, the environmental crisis and sort of the connection of the system design to overshooting the planet, I had this idea that, this was really naive, by the way, that, I was a reasonably smart guy, not smarter than the average, but smart enough to figure out what the problem was. And yet I came from Wall Street and mainstream finance, and in a sense, I had credibility with all the people that run the world, so to speak. So plan A, this was now 12, 15 years ago, was, I just need to go back and explain what I've learned to all the people running the world, and everything will be good. And that burden, first of all, that's a really naive idea. Turns out the people that run the world aren't nearly as curious as I am, and as probably most people on this call. But secondly, it created a huge burden on me personally, because I felt almost like I was, it was my purpose to bring this new knowledge back to the people in power. And for the life of me, I couldn't figure out how to communicate with them effectively. And in fact, the more I would talk about it, the more I sort of felt the distance. I felt slipping away from them. And they once you don't have a quote big job on Wall Street, no one really needs to take you that seriously. But so it was a difficult time. And my wife found this little statue of Atlas in a junk shop somewhere and brought it home to me as a reminder that there's lots of people that are carrying this burden, and not to take myself seriously, basically, or too seriously.
A lot of those people are on this call today, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Welcome.
But thinking about that sort of that change, I thought, can you explain the essence of regenerative economics as you see it to us, please? Sort of maybe talk through those 8 principles of regeneration and how you came to crystallize around those.
Well, the idea is really pretty simple, which is that it really begins with Gaia Theory and the Gaia hypothesis, and the idea that the entire biosphere, the entire planet, is a living system. And of course, that was a very controversial idea when James Lovelock first proposed it in the 1960s. But from my study of system science, that's, the experts kind of quibble over what living means, but there's no question anymore that the planet is this self-organizing, self-regulating kind of miracle that is quite unique, and at least as far as we know, in our planetary sphere, and is miraculous. And of course, we human beings are living systems. I don't think that's controversial. And so I just had this sort of really clear understanding that if the real world is described and accurately described as being organized in fractal patterns, where these patterns repeat from the very large scale to the microscopic scale, and that if there were common patterns and qualities that described how living systems work, and if you assume the human economy is a living system because it's made up of living systems embedded within a larger living system, and those are all assumptions which we could debate. But if you assume that all that is accurate, then it became clear to me that it would not be possible for the human economy to be sustainable like other living systems unless it too looked like, mirrored, had the qualities of, follow the patterns of other living systems. And that's really the whole essence of it. And I would argue that to make the case that that's not true is an awful lot harder to accept that that must be true. And we could maybe debate that if anyone has alternative views on that in this conversation. But if you just accept that as the premise that the human economy needs to behave and look like a living system, and you look at capitalism or socialism through that lens, you suddenly realize all of the places where it's not congruent with that idea. And they're very different than the quote solutions that we normally look to when we're trying to solve the sustainability crisis. So it's truly a fresh lens, a fresh doorway to see an intractable problem. And the secret of it really is that the hopeful aspect of it for me personally, and during the years when my wife found that little statue, I was in pretty extreme states of despair. And the cool thing about the regenerative process, which does describe the workings, the process of living systems, is that it unlocks potential that isn't seen in advance. So if you think about a child or any of us as human beings, when we are truly in sync, in rhythm, in flow, we tap into a potential that we wouldn't have known existed before that happens. And that potential is the source of hope and our future prosperity, I believe, because the game of exponential growth on a finite planet has reached its natural course and limitations. So, without getting into, there aren't any 8 principles. I wrote, and here's where I can say I'm not a total fraud, because I have written pretty extensively about this, and the book is a next chapter or a next version of a lot of what I've already written. And so I came up with 8 principles. In the book, I'm going to tweak them a bit. And the point isn't that there are 8 principles. There's certainly, the complexity of living systems are not reducible to any number of principles. So the point is to use the principles I described if they make sense to you, or, there's lots of other people who have talked about how living systems work, and use those if they make more sense. And the other thing we've learned is that the patterns and principles are kind of context specific. So Janine Benyus talks about green chemistry because she's very focused downstream on products and materials. Whereas if you're working more upstream the way I am on the system itself, green chemistry is too, it's too specific to make it as a one of 8 principles. But it's really the idea that there are patterns and principles that explain this regenerative process. And I'd say the other thing, most importantly, is that the regenerative I keep using the word process. It's not laws that describe the living world. The laws of physics, Newtonian physics, it turns out really only apply at the very microscopic level. And when you get to systems, at least the ecologists and the system scientists that I've studied like to talk about processes, because it's a continually dynamic unfolding reality as opposed to a set of strict laws. And thinking that economics and finance are going to behave in accordance with strict laws are in many ways what's gotten us into the problem in the first place. So I'd be happy to talk about the 8 principles, but they're in the papers, and just as maybe as one example, the idea of balance is, to me, constant in living systems, and that applies to everything from the balance of the feminine and the masculine, to the balance of the multiple capitals, and I'm giving a little secret into what I'm likely to tweak in the book, but I'm increasingly thinking this idea, and I'd be curious, John, for your reaction to this, but this idea of triple bottom line or multiple capital framework is currently in my principles, as I use the language holistic wealth, but really the principle at work is balance as opposed to optimizing. And in finance and in economics, we're used to optimizing everything. If it's finance, we optimize risk-adjusted return. If it's if it's business, we optimize profits. And in living systems, we find that everything is in balance, from, you know, the carbon cycle and the water cycle. All of these things don't optimize, they balance in a sort of an ongoing dance. And so to try to reduce the qualities of living systems to the fewest fundamental principles, I think we can actually even put John's triple bottom line and the whole multiple capital framework underneath the category of balance. And again, another little hint of what I've just learned recently that's missing in my 8 principles is this idea of chance, and not random chance, but complex chance. And again, it's a reason to be hopeful. It turns out in real living systems, there are events that occur that are interconnected with the history and interconnected with other processes that are happening, but they're unpredictable, unknowable, and that defines the complexity. And as and I saw Trey Cates is on the call. What I learned from Alan Savory is that the disturbance of a system is what triggers possibilities for new forms of order. So if you combine having chance with disturbance, and of course we have lots of disturbance in the world now, you have the possibility of reaching a higher level of complexity and a higher level of order out of that random chance and disturbance. And I don't know if this is, I'm sort of not sure I'm articulating this well, but again, that to me is a reason for hope, is that we have, where we have lots of diversity in a system and lots of perturbations, and we have random chance, we have the possibility of finding new pathways toward order at a higher level of complexity. And so as chaotic as everything feels right now, one could look at that and say, well, that's complex living systems doing what they do well, which is searching for new structures, new order, new ways of organization. And it feels tremendously unsettling, but it's actually the system, in a sense, it's the water in a pot on the stove beginning to start to boil and seeking a new form of order that will again be more stable, or it'll collapse. I mean, the outcome is not certain, but a hopeful way of thinking about it is our job is to help it find this higher level of complexity. And thank goodness for all of the disturbance and the diversity, and thank goodness that there's complex chance involved so that new forms of order can emerge.
Yes. And so when we, thinking about what you were just talking about there, when we think about living system principles and aligning our economic systems with those patterns and principles, where do you see signs of this kind of thinking, or the understanding of the need for this kind of thinking resonating amongst kind of international leadership across all sectors, not just business?
Well, certainly, you know, and where I discovered it was in my work under the sort of what Alan Savory is one of my real teachers in this. And so certainly in the broad category of agriculture that includes both, you know, crop agriculture as well as large landscape land management, and the, you know, the interaction between humanity and the land is probably the most fundamental piece of our entire economy, as well as our role on this planet. And that's where regeneration began. You know, permaculture is an expression of regeneration, and certainly that's where a lot of the interest and focus is now. And a company like Danone is probably at the forefront of leading this understanding among, you know, leaders in the world of business. You know, it's stunning to me how slow the whole UN climate process has been to recognize this, and there's some reasons for that make sense. The science on it is very complex. The science on soil science, and and the connection to the carbon cycle is very complex. But if you think about it, we're all up in arms about Brazil tearing down the Amazon. And yet the United States and any other large breadbasket on this planet has already clear-cut the tall grass prairies that are the second largest carbon sink after the oceans. And so now we grow corn and soybean as if, that's the normal thing to do, when it used to be a beautifully fertile, complex ecosystem called the grasslands. And the grasslands had this magical relationship with large herbivores dating back to the dinosaurs and then the buffalo. And that created this symbiotic win-win relationship. In-right relationship is another one of my principles, between large animals and grasslands, which had all kinds of biodiversity benefits, water retention benefits, and oh, by the way, carbon sequestration as a fundamental outcome of that process. So agriculture is definitely ground zero of this conversation. And I think most of the business community that is latching onto this is probably thinking of it as an agricultural phenomenon. But that's new in the last couple of years. And so I think increasingly, in fact, I happen to know that Danone actually understands that this goes well beyond just agriculture. And I think that will increasingly be true. I learned, and we all probably learned, that even Walmart has declared it wants to be a regenerative company. I don't know what they understand that to mean. But I think it's just in the time that I've been in this space, and the first paper I published on this was in 2015 called Regenerative Capitalism, and there was an earlier version of it a year or so before that, and back then there was no one in the business community really using the word. In fact, Carol Sanford, who's one of my teachers also, she was told not to use the word regenerative because no one will know what it means. So she wrote a book called Responsible Business. So just in the last 10 years, this has gone from being invisible to, I think, very much front of mind. And now even the great John Elkington has written a book about regenerative capitalism.
Well, talking about books, I'd like to come round to your book. So,
the book.
Is there anything more you can tell us about it? You've sort of alluded to the fact that it's building on sort of the previous thinking you've done. What other insights can you share with us about it?
Well, the biggest thing that's going to be new about it, rather than just taking the two quite long papers I've written, one on regenerative economics and one on regenerative finance, and stapling them together, which I thought is what it would be, but it turns out that doesn't work. But the longer I've been in this search and conversation, and the more I'm really just blown away by the miracle of this regenerative process, and seeing it in the context of the real world we now live in. And obviously 2020 is just, where it all sort of exploded together. I've come to not just sort of suspect, but firmly believe that this is part of this shift in eras. And I have a slide when I give a talk that is, we're not just in an era of change, we're in a change in era. And so, there's a lot of academics that have been talking about the postmodern era and what comes after the modern age. But in the mainstream, among political leaders and business leaders, I don't think, in fact, someone, I forget the author's name, wrote a book called The End of History not long ago, where the belief was that with our scientific prowess and the modern age and scientific revolution that led to all of these great insights, we had somehow completed our understanding of how the universe works. And what I believe now, and what will be the large frame of the book, is that we're transitioning into whatever era it is that history will call what happened after the modern age. And a lot of people are using the language integral age, and certainly integral is a fundamental next step in I think in human civilization. But increasingly, because we're in such a dire situation, I haven't finally decided this, and I'd be curious for all of your feedback on this, but I actually believe that there's a kind of a mini era between the modern age and the integral age. I don't think we're ready for the integral age. It's so far beyond where we are, and we've done so much damage that I'm going to propose in the book that we've entered the regenerative age, and that if we don't figure out how to reorganize human civilization in alignment with the regenerative process, we will slip back into some kind of dark age and have to reorganize society from a much lower level of complexity with a lot of damage being done in the process. But if we manage to, in a sense, leap onto this regenerative understanding, then the next, call it 100 to, it might take 500 years, but hopefully 100 years will be an era of healing both human health and planetary health, such that the integral age actually becomes possible. So that's the big new framing that I'm proposing in the book. Still searching for a title, so curious if anyone has a suggestion on that. And then otherwise, it's I would say more new examples and details that hopefully bring these ideas a bit more concretely to life.
And how is this book working in with the other things you're doing? Is it something that you're using? Because you've talked about, I think, regenerative villages is one of the things you're doing. Is this part of a kind of a big master plan of sorts?
Oh yeah, I wish. Remember the importance of complex chance and random processes. But no, what's exciting is that there is hopefully this summer coming together a couple of pieces. I'm probably letting the cat out of the bag a little bit here, but there's actually a film being done to celebrate, in a sense, James Lovelock's life. I think he's 100 years old, living happily in the United Kingdom, and tracing lots of the emergent ideas applied to economics back to his original hypothesis all the way back in the 1960s, which of course is echoing what the indigenous wisdom from all around the world has always known and always believed, which is that the planet is a living system. And so there's this film documentary coming out on the idea of Gaia and its application to economies. And so my work will be featured in that. And if I can get the book done in time, that all comes out at the same time. And that'll be a bit of an unveiling, if you will, of a lot of people's work. Janine Benyus is in the film, and all of that does tie into our Regenerative Communities Network, which are kind of the tangible places on the ground where people have been working on regenerative development for decades, and we're trying to knit them together into a network so that A, they learn from each other, and B, the outside world sees them as a new form of development as opposed to a bunch of random one-off projects. And then at the same time, we've just started a new company currently called Regenerative Capital Advisors, which will have both educational tools and courses, but also advisory services to companies and investors, in particular, those who allocate capital, to try to help them first see and then work into this. Because frankly, it's not like anyone really knows how to do this. This is all still in the realm of R&D and experimentation. But there are very practical business models that exist in the world that are profitable and are tapping this potential in ways that are remarkable. So the question is how to imagine new ones, because if you talk about the ones that exist, you never would have thought of them because they're counterintuitive, because they're not incremental changes of what exists. They're much more radically different.
Yes. Well, I can see we've got suggestions coming in for your book title, which we'll get to.
Oh, good. Wait, I got to get a pen.
I will turn to everyone's questions shortly, but I did want to ask you. You talk about it having been a search, this, and I wonder, did you ever sort of think about giving up and just going in a different direction? Because it is tough trying to plow a furrow against the grain.
Yeah, I guess I did. I feel I don't really have a choice on this. I've been, it feels like a calling, I guess, since you've asked me to get personal, I'll get personal. I don't have a choice but to pursue this work. When I feel that it's hopeless and that I'm a lone voice in the wilderness, which I am. It's not hopeless, but I do feel a lone voice in the wilderness. I'll just get an email out of the blue, and I'll realize that there are more people hungry for this, that it's touching, that I'll ever know, particularly since I'm not big on social media, and that I'm playing a role to shift the way the world is seeing the current crises. And what's hopeful and promising and keeps me going is that, and this is going to sound terrible, but the worse things get, the more open people are to this kind of thinking. And so now it feels like a wave, and yet we're still in the first inning. But when I joke about giving up, it's to sort of retire and become a farmer in my local community. So if you hear that John decided to become an organic farmer, you know that I've given up. But as my wife reminds me, I'd probably be a really lousy farmer. So I'm afraid we're stuck with it for a while.
Well, I also
I can't give up. It's too important. Yeah. I have 3 kids. We all
this is it.
We look at our kids and we don't give up.
Well, I asked the question because it's sort of ramping up here in the UK, the focus turning to COP, of course, being on our doorstep, obviously a way away, but still it's all ramping up. And I just wonder about kind of how this is all landing with the international leadership and the international community, and just thinking about, all our kind of work to bring this thinking onto their agenda and the importance of doing that. And it's quite a finite window that we have. So just any reflections you've got on that?
Yeah, it's sort of funny because one would think that someone like me, who came out of JP Morgan and still has contacts with important people, would be pursuing the leaders as my strategy for change. And I don't find the energy there. It's a personal choice. I'm not at all suggesting that it's not important, but our leaders don't know how to lead us because they are so busy, and so you don't become a leader by questioning the institution you're leading or the system that the institution is a leader in. So whether it's a business or a government, they're almost by definition perfectly set up not to be able to lead this transition. And if you probe a CEO of, there are exceptions, obviously, but most CEOs, in my experience, and John has spent his career probably proving that I'm wrong, but I haven't found the deep questioning and curiosity that is necessary, and the humility and the recognition of our ignorance among our quote leaders, and the politicians I spend a lot less time with and suspect I would find even less confidence in. But where the energy is and where the change is happening is much more, I hate to use the word grassroots because it sort of trivializes it, but this is bubbling up, bottoms up. And so that's where my energy is naturally pulled. And so I kind of go where I feel the energy, which isn't to say that it's not critical to get this on the agenda of the COP and all that. But I just, having a few leaders say the right words to me is not success. And building thousands of businesses, entrepreneurial businesses that are doing the right thing is where this change is going to happen, I believe.
Absolutely. I would love to ask about your reflection on the kind of the younger generation, or the sort of the next generation as well around that. But I've seen a question. I'll kick off with one from John, because I'm keeping in the theme of John's for the moment. John talked about how sustainability got mainstreamed and then diluted. And the same is happening on speed to ESG. So his question is, how do we ensure regeneration continues to mean what we want it to mean?
Yeah, great question. I was involved in a number of conversations 2, 3, 4 years ago where we were wrestling with that question. And it was when no one ever heard of us or the word. And honestly, there was a fair amount of, my principles are better than yours. And if you don't believe in, my God, then, you're not a legitimate regenerative person. And it wasn't ever unpleasant, but you could tell that this was becoming a sort of a religious, who has the right to speak for the term, and a genuine fear that it would be dumbed down once the big marketing budgets got a hold of it, and you're already seeing some of that. I don't know. I don't think it's possible to control what people mean when they say regenerative. So I personally don't get myself too worried about it. But what I try to do is not get swept into the euphoria when leaders start using the word, and always question whether what their use of the word, whether they really understand what it means, and certainly whether their policies suggest they understand what it means. And I think this is going to be, decades minimum of tension and turmoil around shifting the way, it's literally shifting the way we see and think about the world. And so whenever you hear someone with key performance indicators or solutions to problems, or anything that feels like optimize this or optimize that, even if they draw diagrams that have feedback loops and all this, chances are they're still trapped in a reductionist problem solving kind of mindset, as opposed to seeing more holistically. And I think it's really hard. I do it all the time myself. And so all we can do is keep the integrity of this idea alive without sounding like, I understand better than you do, or I'm smarter than you, because the truth is humanity has been trained to think in this reductionist way for 400 or 500 years. So it's literally baked into our DNA. And all of our academies train us to think in a reductionist way, and they're organized in a reductionist way. And so this is not like you just pick up a pamphlet and get the talking points and learn the new goals and learn the new KPIs, and you can go implement this. This is really, really hard. And I think the best thing going for us is that we will try to do this and it won't work. And we'll go back to the drawing board and recognize, oh, we're not really doing it yet. We're still falling back into the thinking of the world as parts. And, you know, welcome to the challenge and the frustration, and don't get frustrated by it, I guess.
Yes, absolutely. Well, a couple of questions have come in with regard to the feeling about grassroots, and they're essentially around the sort of same kind of theme. Question from Paul Haney. So if we start action from grassroots fiefdoms in a small locality, how does this change bubble up to the macro level? Does it need purposeful action to join the fiefdoms together, or does it happen organically? And Richard, one of our Volans team, says, you know, grassroots, absolutely, but if we don't sort of change the rules of the game, i.e. really via politics, how can we stop regeneration remaining a niche?
Yeah. So I go to, so one of my teachers is Dana Meadows, who was, as many of you will know, the lead author of Limits to Growth back in the 70s, and wrote another book called Thinking in Systems, if I remember correctly. And she has this great framework of leverage points, places to intervene in a system. And what I'll never, it just sort of hit me like, this is truth. She goes through, you know, goals and numbers and all this stuff that all makes intuitive sense. Some of it isn't that intuitive because it's feedback loops and stuff. But then she gets down to like the top two places to change the system. And one, the second highest one is the goals of the system. And there's a lot of work around goals of our economy, right? I mean, SDGs are alternative goals to GDP, planetary boundaries, Kate Raworth's donut, I think of as a goal. And so that conversation is alive and happening. But in order for policy to shift, I believe that we need to shift the paradigm, because the policymakers only make policies that are affirming the accepted paradigm. So right now, the accepted paradigm is GDP growth, even though there's all this conversation about all this other stuff. When people aren't thinking, all they say is, well, how do we get the economy growing faster to create prosperity? As opposed to a much more nuanced, you know, this segment of the economy or this region of the economy or this industry we need to grow, and yet we need to fade that one out. I mean, it's just much more complex than binary growth or shrink. And frankly, the degrowth community is guilty of that as well. It's you know, if we shrink the global economy, you can forget about anything you care about. We're going to be in global chaos. So we need to be much more nuanced about what's growing and what's shrinking. And but having said that, I may be wrong on this. And you know, I mean, there are some policies that are in discussion that are totally aligned with this. I'll give one quick example, which should be resurrected now with what's going on in the stock markets. But about 8 years ago, in the wake of the financial crisis, the topic of financial transaction taxes were on the agenda in the mainstream. And Europe in particular was trying to push this. And the idea being that if you put a little tax on speculation, you would disincentivize speculation. Makes sense. You'd also wipe out the entire high frequency trading industry because it operates on such tiny little margins that a tiny little tax would actually eliminate the profitability of most of that trading. And when Wall Street has become one big casino of high frequency trading, you would fundamentally restructure the way trading works. And of course, we didn't have the courage to do that. And so, you know, time goes on and the casino is now just morphed into a more extreme version of a casino with this whole Robin Hood phenomenon. And the reason this matters is not the reason that the people who are pushing the policies to fix it think it matters. Everyone is sort of celebrating the democratizing of Wall Street. and the little guy can compete with the big guy. Well, I look at it through a regenerative systems lens, and the first principle that's been violated is the relationship, the right relationship principle. So we've gone from the purpose of capital markets are the capital formation process to create and capitalize business enterprises. And what's happened is the tail's wagging the dog, and the purpose of capital markets is now a speculative game that is being played by very, very big hedge funds and now very little guys in their basements, people in their basements. And yet it's all about speculating and nothing about having a right relationship with a business enterprise that has a purpose that is in the interest of civilization to succeed. And so it's actually that all the speculation is actually damaging the trust in the system that is central to the whole capital formation process. So I'm a huge fan of a high frequency or a financial transaction tax, but for the reason to return the capital markets, or at least to nudge them in a direction that is a more healthy capital formation idea, and to essentially wipe out all of the speculative activity that's actually, it's actually in conflict with how living systems work. Because by definition, when you speculate, there's a winner and a loser. The war on GameStop, there's the guys that are short that are getting crushed, and then there's the guys that are squeezing the thing that are making money until it goes back down. But it's a win-lose situation, which is not the nature of relationships in living systems. So by definition, we should eliminate it, which means that the amount of trading volume on the stock exchanges would drop by well over 50% in my ideal world. But I can't go in and argue to some policymaker that we should do something to cause trading to drop by 50%, because their worldview is that trading creates efficiency, which creates growth, which is good for prosperity. So good luck making that argument. So it's a long-winded way of saying, until we shift the paradigm, the way we see the world, I'm not optimistic we're going to do the policy shifts that are really necessary. Having said that, there's stuff we can do as band-aids, like a carbon tax or a high-frequency trading or a financial transaction tax, and we should do that. But I'm more interested in, for my own work, getting clear on the framework and the true design of what a truly regenerative system would look like. And that'll be in there's actually 10 policy suggestions that'll be in the book, most of which people will laugh at as being unrealistic. But again, Dana Meadows said, the most important part of policymaking is vision, and very, very infrequently do we see policymakers expressing a vision as opposed to responding to problems that they're trying to solve. So,
absolutely.
Anyway, that was a long-winded answer to a very specific question.
Not at all. No, it was really great, and I think having that vision is really important. I mean, as one of our clients, the Scottish Environment Protection Agency, has that level of vision as well. A question though, thinking about capital, you mentioned capital. Peter Head had a question previously. Dasgupta and Terracotta have put over the idea that bringing in natural capital is the future. So nature is the engine of the economy. This is dangerous as it does not recognize limits to growth. We need regeneration to take center stage, which is what you were saying. Do you have anything further to say on that?
Well, I mean, I'm obviously in agreement. And here again, it gets to the unconscious trap of worldviews that very well-meaning, smart people are victims of. So the whole idea of putting a price on ecosystem services, and this is very controversial within there's a field called ecological economics, which I think of as the precursor to regenerative economics. The regenerative is sort of taking ecological economics to its logical conclusion, as opposed to retreating back to a neoliberal framework in order to try to, this is actually a great example of the policy question. So we all care about the planet, or we wouldn't be on this call. And we all recognize that natural capital is not priced into the current system. So it's totally logical to say we need to put a price on nature and integrate it into the system. And you get ideas like putting price on ecosystem services. And there's one practical reality of that we've already experienced, which is that the academic who's most recognized as the leader of environmental economics and developed a model to calculate the optimal global warming we should shoot for as our target in order to not harm our economic growth too much, I'm having a little mental block on the name. It'll come back to me. It happens all the time. But anyway, he won the Nobel Prize 2 years ago for his model that essentially said the answer is 3.5 degrees Celsius. We should shoot for 3.5 degrees Celsius because anything lower would cost too much economic growth. So he's trapped in there's an assumption there, which is economic growth is the source of prosperity, and that remains unquestioned. And so his policy recommendation is going to be do whatever you need to do to tax carbon, blah, 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 but don't interfere with economic growth beyond 3.5 degrees warming, which of course is a disaster. And so I think, the topic of biodiversity is now bubbling up as the next great crisis after climate. Well, of course, it's the same crisis, point one. But point two, if we now try to put a price on biodiversity, good luck. I mean, it's one thing to put a price on carbon. It's one gas, or you can convert the gases into a CO2 equivalent. And yes, you could create a tax on that, but it's just impossible to get your head around what putting a price on biodiversity would begin to look like, much less we'd have the data to measure it. And I mean, it's just an impossible task. Whereas if we recognize that what matters is not the value of the butterfly pollinating the flower, but that the function of pollination is essential, a non-negotiable, and it can't be fixed with money. Peter Brown, one of my teachers in this journey, has a great way of saying it. He said, there's a difference between a cost that can be fixed with money and a wrong that can never be fixed. And so we're dangerously slipping into thinking we can fix stuff with money that can't be fixed with money. And I agree with whoever asked the question or made the statement. And yes, I see in the chat, William Nordhaus is the economist.
Yes.
Thank you, whoever, Richard, who won the Nobel Prize for a model that it says 3.5 degrees is the answer. But and this is I mean, a lot of people will disagree with this that are in the ecological economics profession, because they're now getting traction with creating natural capital balance sheets and putting prices on ecosystem services and showing how valuable they are, and that's all good. But that doesn't mean that the solution is to integrate those into our neoliberal framework. To me, the obvious solution is we got a broken framework, and we need an entirely different framework that will see the patterns and principles and processes are what need to be our compass, as opposed to relying on the compass that's gotten us in this mess in the first place, which is the compass of we can put a price on everything and the market will solve the problem.
Yes, absolutely. I just wonder sometimes if there is enough optimism around being able to do that and make those changes in the time frame, that's here. I mean, you talk about a sense of urgency.
Well, there's not, and it's going to get worse. But the worse it gets, the faster we'll react. So no one predicted 10 years before the Berlin Wall would fall down that the Berlin Wall is going to fall down in 10 years. And so I think we're in for a tremendously, look what happened last year. And we probably subconsciously think, phew, glad that one was over. When this year or next year is likely to be even more tumultuous. But the more that happens, the more we are going to be forced to change. Just like the more you turn up the heat on a pot of water on the stove, the more it starts to bubble to the point where it has to bubble, or if the top is sealed on the pot, it blows up. And so if we don't adapt, if we don't change, if we don't go through this phase shift transition, we will collapse. And you could make an argument very easily that we're already in collapse, and that we will rebuild our civilization in a very different way, from a very hard place. But for me, the reason I don't get despondent about this is that I've seen this through, in particular, my investment projects, there is this regenerative potential. It's the same genius that, the child prodigy is allowed to play piano and becomes this virtuoso at age, 12. I think every person has a genius waiting to be unlocked. And I think every organization has a genius waiting to be unlocked. And I think the whole system has a genius. And our task is to unlock that. And we will find prosperity that we can't see today. So it's unimaginable. Therefore, it's easy to get despondent. But it's real.
So in terms of that unlocking, John Elkington had a question, starting with paradigm shifts, said Thomas Kuhn, who introduced the concept in the early 60s, are nauseating for those raised in the old order. They fight back increasingly energetically. So how do we prepare leaders in all sectors to cope in this gradually, then suddenly future?
Well, I don't know if I have a good answer for that, John. I know you're in the business of preparing and helping leaders. But as I said earlier, I don't, it's not to suggest that it's not worth trying, but I do think our theory of change needs to recognize that leaders are leaders because they've mastered the old paradigm. And maybe more importantly, and you probably know this way better than I, but even when you find a leader who gets it and wants to change, they've got to turn a battleship. The bigger the organization they lead, the harder it is to change an organization. And there's nothing wrong with big organizations being crushed that need to be crushed. I mean, ExxonMobil is in the process of being crushed. And you were not going to convince Lee Raymond or his successor of anything. And so it would have been a complete waste of time to spend with Lee Raymond, who, by the way, was the CEO of Exxon when they were doing the climate denial. And he still hasn't been held to account. I always rant that he was, until the end of last year, the lead director of JP Morgan, who was the lead funder of fossil fuels until this day. And I always like to say that's not the JP Morgan I worked for. But certainly in examples like that, it's just a complete waste of our time. And we should allow, fortunately the market crushed Exxon, but not for the reasons we all would like to believe. The market crushed Exxon because oil prices collapsed. And not because of divestment. I'm sorry. Had oil prices not collapsed, Exxon wouldn't be crushed. And so, getting back to your question about leaders, I think the leadership is going to come from the next generation who are going to demand. I think Jenny, you were starting to ask about the younger generation, but they're not going to work for Exxon. They're not going to work for organizations that don't get it. And that's, to me, where I put it this way. I always, if someone who is sort of under 40, under 35 reaches out to me and wants to talk, I never say I'm too busy. And if I sense that they are genuinely curious, whereas if I sense that a CEO of a big company wanted to figure out how to use this word and term as a way to be, seen as at the cutting edge, but clearly didn't understand, I wouldn't waste my time.
That's funny. It's not funny, but it's the same with our John. John will always have a cup of tea with a younger person, won't you, John? Seeing them as the next generation. So a question which came in before from Björn, thinking about sort of the antithesis of the exons. The question is, what would a regenerative organization look, be, and feel like? Gregory Landau and Ethan Rowland speak of regenerative enterprise. How would you apply regenerative systems thinking to the future of work, is the question.
Great question. So a quick anecdote. Greg Landau was at a conference I spoke at when I was sort of just first rolling out this idea. And he came up, he was very polite. He said, "Oh, that was really good. Here, let me give you a copy of my book." Which, in other words, welcome to, so there's nothing new under the sun. But, I mentioned earlier, I saw Trey Cates is on this call. And Capital Institute has a deep relationship with In Rhythm, the firm. And Trey's work is as good as I've seen on bringing this regenerative idea into organizations, large and small. And I've seen it work. I met Trey over 10 years ago because he was the chief operating officer of the Savory Institute. And I've seen the Savory Institute implement this organizational design framework that Trey and his colleagues have developed. And maybe he should talk about it, since at least he was on here earlier. I don't know if he was still on, but the way to think about it is that an organization is a living being. And just like all of us, if we're told that our job description is this, and there's the cog you're supposed to fit in, and don't ask any questions, just do what you're told, you're going to have a pretty unhappy, uninspired employee. And your productivity as a result is going to suffer. But imagine if you organized the organization around the genius of all the people that show up every morning, and figure out a way to allow them to manifest their regenerative potential, and then steer that toward an organization with a purpose that is regenerative for the planet and human civilization. Then you have something really powerful. And I can almost feel the energy in seeing a couple of you nodding. I've said this to people, and they say, "You're giving me chills." I mean, we know innately that there's this huge damage we're causing to our humanity by forcing people into big companies and telling them that their job is this, and oh, by the way, at the end of the year, you sucked at this, you sucked at this, you sucked at that, you were good at this, do better next year, go get them. And if you do X, I'll give you a 10% bonus. I mean, that's just not a way to motivate people. And what Trey and his team have done is they've sort of put all this into a tool that a company can measure their organizational health by. And so the company gets a checkup at the beginning of the process, and they end up, reporting that they're on a scale of 1 to 10, they're a 3. And in these 8 categories, here's, the sub pieces of it, and with very practical things that need to be done to improve the regenerative nature of that company. And you can move from being degenerative to transactional to regenerative, and you can see that process. And the reason why this is, to me, so powerful is I've seen the outcome of Savory Institute, which is a nonprofit, but doing pretty interesting global complex work. And there's no question in my mind that divisions of big organizations and entire big companies could benefit from the similar process. So it's, I tend to work at the system level, and this is very much at the organizational level. And you could develop an entire framework for each of us at an individual level. And again, the idea is that if these are all living systems, then these patterns are fractal, so that what works for us as individuals should work in our families, in our organizations, in our bioregions, and in the global economy.
Well, I can see from
How's that for a plug for In Rhythm?
Well, Trey put a question up earlier around exactly what you've just answered, and I can see there's a slew of enthusiasm for exactly this kind of thinking.
I should say, full disclosure, I am an investor in Rhythm, so you should know that I have a bias on that. But the reason I'm an investor is that I think so highly of it. So.
We've got a question here from Greg, which is Greg Watson. What do you see as the impact of universal investors? Many claim to have 100-year liability timeframes and can see the collapse coming up fast. Some of them are showing leadership, though. So, for example, versus Exxon. So, isn't this ground for optimism?
It is, and it's interesting. This term "universal owner" kind of crept up. I didn't see it coming, and I guess I like it. What I don't like about it is that it's so that, I think of the sovereign wealth fund as a universal owner, and the Norwegian sovereign wealth fund is probably the most well documented, and their investment strategy is essentially to own the entire world economy, right? So they own a little bit of pretty much everything. And they've figured out how to do that at a very low cost, and it keeps them out of the politics of, do I own Exxon or don't I own Exxon? So, and here, I'm going to say this as gently as I can, but here you have one of the most, one of the wealthiest in terms of financial assets institutions on the planet, whose source of that wealth is fossil fuels, and who has a tiny country, relatively speaking, and yet that wealth is trapped in a completely agnostic, I own a tiny slice of everything, so I care about everything, but I'm responsible for nothing. Relationship. That's not the relationship that I think is an example of how living systems actually work. Relationships, the relationship between, if we're going to have a capitalist system of private ownership of institutions, of big institutions that do business, that define the bulk of the economy, there needs to be a relationship and a healthy symbiotic relationship between the source of capital and the enterprise. And I don't think that's possible if you own, 0.5% of every company on planet Earth. It's just physically not possible to exercise your responsibility. And sure, it's better if you vote your proxy than if you don't, blah, blah, blah. But think about the responsibility that an activist shareholder takes or a leveraged buyout firm takes. They go in and they take either the entire board, if they take it private, or they take 3 board seats and create a ruckus, and they influence that company. And so we may not like what the activists' agenda is. Usually we won't, but they make an impact. And for their partners, they're taking responsibility for that capital to execute their agenda in a way that is very meaningful. Now, again, 9 times out of 10, we're not going to agree with what that agenda is. It's going to be very short-term, extractive, and opportunistic. But imagine if the sovereign wealth funds and the pension funds behaved in a similar way for an agenda that we do support. That, to me, is what a universal owner needs to do. And I haven't yet weighed in on this in this conversation. It's something that I hope to in the future. But again, the trouble is the paradigm. The accepted wisdom is that the responsible thing to do is have a highly diversified portfolio and own equities at the lowest cost possible through an index fund, or in the case of Norway, they've managed to lower their costs even below just sticking their money in the Vanguard fund. And then suddenly we think that, you know, the CEO of BlackRock should speak for, you know, should speak for humanity on what companies should do, as opposed to the actual owners of companies who own meaningful percentages and take board seats and take responsibility for them. You know, it's kind of like thinking that you can have a skyscraper owned by nobody and someone will magically fix the roof when it leaks. I think if you want to have someone fix, if we want Exxon to do what we need Exxon to do, the way that works in capitalism is the owner demands it. And we don't have any owners of Exxon who are in a position to demand anything. And selling Exxon shares sends a nice signal, but it doesn't change what Exxon does with their drilling budget. Sorry, I'm on a rant.
No. I'm thinking about then, you know, thinking about sort of the strategy of change for mainstreaming the regenerative economy. So forgetting about the Exxons, what you mentioned before, strategy for change. So what do you think is the right strategy for change for mainstreaming the regenerative economy? You know, what gives you cause for optimism around this? Where do you see that happening?
Well, I guess the main thing, the first thing that comes to my mind is we need to do a much better job at helping people make this shift that I'm still in the process of. You know, in a sense, I've been on this full time for a decade. And who else is going to do such a stupid thing and spend a decade of their life trying to get their brain rewired to think holistically? So I think we need to make it much easier for people to go down that pathway. And you know, we're actually working on an idea now that would involve not just course materials like the traditional way, but also like gamifying the whole thing. And so, you know, imagine if you know, someone told me that the gaming industry is bigger than the music industry and the film industry combined. And so we need to use the new tools, the new medium to help exponentially accelerate this paradigm into the consciousness of folks. And my partner, Ernesto von Peeborg, happens to know a lot about how to do that. And so we're working on that. And so that's, I think, point number one. Point number two is I do think we need to work with the early adopters. It's sort of nothing new here, but there are big companies and governments that are now, you know, it's kind of like the incoming phone call is the one you want to focus on. When they call us, as opposed to us standing up on our soapbox, then we need to respond and be supportive. And Danone is to me exhibit A in that. Walmart has expressed their desire to become a regenerative company, and I think we absolutely need to work to support these big companies in understanding what that means, what's involved. But they're not going to be able to do it out of the current short-term share appreciation capital market system, because the capital market system is in conflict with how living systems work. So, you know, my advice to Unilever when they got attacked, and my advice to Danone today, and my advice to Walmart would be the first thing they need to do if they want to truly adapt this regenerative paradigm is fix their broken shareholder ownership situation so that they have owners who are truly supporting, not you know, sunny day when everything's, as long as you can keep growing quarterly earnings supporting, but truly supporting the incredibly difficult transformation that is required. And you know, for a business like Walmart, it's one thing to talk about their supply chain, which is global and therefore is a problem. But what about their footprint and all of their superstores that's already done a lot of damage to lots and lots of communities? You know, how do you begin to think about that? It's almost like a truth and reconciliation process. Like, okay, now I understand this, and now understand the unintended consequences of the business model that we created with all the best intentions in the world. Now, how are we going to respond in a way that has integrity to what regeneration really means?
Yes. And I think a very interesting point you brought in there around the gamifying, because I think often there's a sort of a sense of regeneration and what that means among people. They see the world changing. It's not being explained to them in their language. So understanding how to communicate that to people, absolutely key.
Yeah, absolutely.
We've only got.
I saw Richard asked or made a comment in the chat. I'd like to respond on, when's the first leverage buyout of a regenerative leverage buyout can happen. So there's actually, I mean, there's not, but really that's getting at the one of the really interesting, exciting potentials that does exist, which is that most of the, and I'm going to make some broad generalizations that are unfair, but many of the big companies that are attacked by the activists, or that were taken private by the leveraged buyout industry, but most of the good pickings have already been picked, are mature cash cow kind of businesses that aren't growing much anymore. And so, the conventional leveraged buyout mentality was, oh, well, we can cut a bunch of costs and, get management really focused and add a bunch of leverage and, small gains on tight margins with a lot of leverage translates into a lot of leverage return on capital. But what they also understood, and this is where they're really smart, but this wasn't part of the narrative that they were selling, is that these mature cash cows have resilient cash flows, okay? And so resilient cash flows are part of what any investor entering into the regenerative era, filled with uncertainty and complexity and pandemics and chaos, should want. So imagine if you're a pension fund, you say you want 7% returns and you need them in order to meet your pension obligations, but you've got this massive asset and liability mismatch. Okay, your assets are you don't own a lot of bonds anymore because they yield close to zero, and so you're getting your returns out of equities. And I'm again simplifying to make my point. And equities have all kinds of risks associated with them that are not well suited to paying off a steady stream of liabilities, which is your pension obligations. And by the way, those pension obligations are inflated, so every year they go up because they're often keyed into inflation. So you've got a fixed annuity that has an inflator on it, and then your assets are equities, which are filled with speculative bubbles these days, ramped by the governments of the world with QE. So you're in a terrible, terrible risk position. And what you should want are steady, resilient cash flows as your assets that match your liabilities. And this is sort of banking 101, matching assets and liabilities. And by the way, the Canadian pension system gets this and does this. They acquire infrastructure assets, not companies. They don't invest 2% in an infrastructure company. They buy the assets and, in their own words, like to own them forever. So getting back to the big mature cash cow businesses, it's not a leap to think that a food business that's got a great brand identity, Hellmann's mayonnaise, for example, in Unilever's case, could be seen as an infrastructure asset generating resilient cash flows and paying out those cash flows to investors, as opposed to trying to grow the Hellmann's mayonnaise business, which is always going to be difficult to grow. But the capital markets reward growth. They don't reward resilient they do. I mean, it's not quite fair. They do reward resilient cash flows, but not as much as they reward growth. So there's an opportunity to restructure the ownership and the securities that effectively capitalize a company like either Walmart or Unilever or Danone in such a way that you give investors what they want, which are the resilient cash flows, and you incentivize management to do all of the regenerative adjustments you want, and reward them not in stock options that trade day to day, but in some long-term contractual right that's linked to the success of the transformation. I mean, it's a lot. I'm throwing out a lot here, but the point is that if you start from the assumption that capital markets are as they are, they will always be as they are, and we're trapped in this quarterly thing, you can't get to, you can't get to a regenerative company any more than you can get to, a solution to climate change if you keep burning fossil fuels.
Well, I mean, we're sadly coming soon. It's flown by towards the end of the book club, but I just want to pick up on, thinking about your point around the opportunity to restructure things, and then thinking about your book, which is what we were ostensibly here to talk about as well. And thinking about you saying that within that, you're going to have your 10 policy suggestions that you sort of said there'll be people, going to laugh at them. And I think, no, there are so many people on this call around the world who want to look at where are these opportunities to restructure things and turn this towards a world that we're actually wanting to work and live within. So I'm sorry that we're running out of time. Thank you so much, John. I mean, sincerely, for your time and your thoughts.
Don't be silly. Thank you.
It's been really enlightening. It's been really great. And thank you everyone as well for your questions. I'm sorry we didn't manage to get to all of them. We had a couple of suggestions for your book title, which I'll share with you afterwards, John. And everyone, please do come to our next book club. We've actually got one later this month. I'm just looking down to see the title and who it's with. It's with Margaret Heffernan, and she's going to be talking about her book Uncharted. So that's on March the 24th. So please do join us for that. And yes, have a lovely evening, everyone. We've probably got time for one more question, actually, according to my clock. So I'm sure our John will pipe up with one, or indeed Richard, who's playing Contrarian this evening. So, yes.
Maybe I could just chip in because John Fullerton earlier on talked about the triple bottom line and the multi-capital scorecard and so on. And I think, again, that's been an area where people have been staking out their territory and so on. And it's odd, but last night was the first time I properly talked to Mark McElroy, because when I withdrew the triple bottom line, well, you can't withdraw or do a product recall, but I attempted. That hit him because he suddenly started finding big companies starting to say, but the concept has been withdrawn and all the rest of it. And so we were talking about, that wasn't the intention. It was a refresh, a reset, and so on. Right. And just to sort of respond to your question earlier on, the way I see it now, and Mark and I are going to do something on it together, is the triple bottom line can do good work if it's in service of regeneration. But the problem is, to date, it's been very much in the responsibility space. And that takes you to trade off thinking about, we're going to do this and then minimize that. So just on that front. And I think, again, that's, to me, an example of the way in which the spirit of what comes next has increasingly to be working with people who are in many ways sort of like-minded but quite competitive, and the question of how we reduce those barriers and get closer in to be. I find I'd always slightly dreaded Mark in a strange way because he was so differently minded and so on, and yet once we put our heads together, it was remarkably, at least for me, productive. So again, just to add my thanks, John, to Jenny's, and just looking at the chat, I think everyone's enjoyed this immensely. So roll on the book. We cannot wait to read it. But
I have no choice. I had no choice but to leave Morgan, and now I have no choice but to finish the book.
Thank you all.
Well, thanks everyone. It was fun.
Thank you. Thank you. And we'll see you for our next book club